Greetings and welcome to a lecture about tables. Yes, truly exciting. Okay, so before we get into this, a little bit of just sort of history and rationale as to why we're having a little bit of a light week, to be honest, and why we're covering tables the way that we are. So, back in the early days, the dark era, HTML 1.0, we didn't have styles. We did not have CSS or cascading style sheets, which we are going to start taking a look at next week. What we had pretty much were tables. Tables were the primary way that you could create interesting layouts in HTML1 era web pages. And let me tell you, things got pretty crazy. We're talking tables nested within tables, nested within tables. It was pure insanity. Be thankful that you have CSS. It is much easier to deal with and much easier to control and get really interesting page layouts than the oldie days of table madness. But tables still have a place in modern day HTML. Like if what you need to do is show a table, a grid of information, then ye old standard table actually works pretty good for doing that. And it can still work for some pretty quick and easy formatting of content, even if using divs and CSS is more flexible and offers more options. It's still a little bit more complicated. Also, I want to show some of the old ways in which we used to format HTML. The reading assignment on W3 Schools with regards to tables is going to show the modern way of using styles to control things like borders and alignments and stuff like that. But I want to show what it used to look like, at least a little bit, which is why we've got some bright red text going on here in the screen. Visual Studio Code is not happy with me. So that's sort of the rationale behind this week. I want to introduce tables, have you practice with them a little bit, get some practice with just general HTML, and talk a little bit about how things used to be done. So that way you can see a little bit of the contrast once we start moving into how they are done today. So with that out of the way, let's start actually talking tables. So table tag, pretty straightforward. If I want to have a table, I put in a table tag, have the matching closing tag after I'm all done with it, and we're good to go. Anything that is table-wide, like the borders around the table, if I want to have all of the text in the table be a certain color or style or etc., anything that is table-wide, you put that into the table tag for its properties. Now, other than the table tag, which you obviously have to have a table, there are two other tags that are of critical importance to a table, and basically it won't work without them. And that is the TR tag for a row of cells, and the TD tag, which is an actual cell in the table. So table row, TR, and table data, TD, both of which have an opening and closing tag that encompasses the information contained therein. So how this works is we open the table tag, we open a row, open a cell, put in that cell's content, which can be text, it can be an image, whatever we want to put in here. And then we close the TD tag. Open the TD tag, put in the cell information, close it, and then we close the row. We want a second row, so we're going to put in another TR tag and rinse and repeat. Cell data, contents, close it, open a cell, contents, close it, close the row, close the table. Now, how this first table is going to look is this. This first cell right up here, or this first block of text, is what that table produces. Cell 1A, cell 2A, 1B, 2B. So pretty straightforward and pretty plain as well. There's, by default, you don't get borders or anything else like that. It's just whatever the text style currently is. There you go, structured into cells. And it will automatically be like as small as possible. Now, tables are fairly robust, as are most things HTML. In this second table here, we've got a bit of an issue. In our second row, we only have one cell. I deleted out the 2B cell. So we just have the cell 1B. And if we flip it back over to our web page here, that's what we would expect to see, right? It's like, that looks okay. It's like, okay, well, I just didn't have any content in that cell there. And that's really not all that uncommon for a table, right? Tables aren't always rectangular grids of information. Sometimes you won't have information to put into a cell. But you shouldn't do that with HTML tables by just simply eliminating a TD tag. Because let's take a look as to what's actually going on there. And for that, we're going to use an old style formatting command, or formatting property, I should say, the border property. Again, this is not how you do it in the modern era. Once we start dealing with CSS, we'll do this the proper way, but this is how it used to be done. So I'm going to say table border equals quotation mark 1px. In other words, I am saying this table has a 1 pixel border around it. And if we flip back over to our web page, here's that first table again, and we can see that, yep, sure enough, there is a 1 pixel border around everything, and it lets us see the formatting a little bit better. Like if I zoom in here, control mouse wheel, by the way, is how you do that. You can see that I'm at 280% zoom here. You can't really see from this. If I highlight it, you can see the gaps. But this shows it really well. There is spacing between the cells and on the outside edges of the cells as well. There's spacing here. Again, we'll deal with that formatting next week. Maybe next week. Maybe in 2 weeks. A lot to talk about for CSS. But in any case, with the borders on, we can see how the individual cells are spaced out from one another. It also makes it a little bit easier to see on the one where we eliminated a cell. It doesn't look quite correct. It's not that there's nothing in this last cell here. That cell doesn't exist. Again, if we flip back over to the code, we are currently looking at this table here. Let me increase font size on this to make it also a little bit easier to see. So this highlighted chunk of HTML is what is producing this table right here. The cell just simply doesn't exist. And while it works okay here, you can't really tell that the cell doesn't exist. It looks a little bit strange here. It's like there should be something here. And I'm spending so much time on this just sort of to illustrate the fact that even if you don't have anything to put in a cell in a table, you should still include that tag. You should still include the TD tag even if there's nothing in here. So we can see by having the empty TD tag Now this table looks a little bit more complete. Like, okay, yeah, there's still nothing in here, but it still looks like a cell in the table versus this one here where it looks like there's an error. And we want to avoid even the chance that the user could perceive something as an error. And so it's really important when you're designing a table just to take a moment and make sure that you've got everything set up correctly. Like, put in content, even if you don't want to have content in there, like have something in the cell just so that you can verify, yes, okay, I didn't skip a tag or I didn't screw anything up on my formatting. This is how it's supposed to be. And then you can take it out and have it look the way you want it to look. Now, there are a couple of very important table properties that are still used and we need to know about. And that is column span, or COL span, and row span. So let's take a look at this right here. This first row, my cell takes up more than one cell. This is a very common thing to have in tables, right? You've got a title section or a header section that needs to take up more than one cell. Or maybe you've got a comment or whatever it is. It's a very common setup in tables that one of your cells is going to be larger than the others. And that is what col span and row span is used for. So let's take a look at this chunk of HTML here, which corresponds to this table right here. We'll come back to the align equals center in a moment. So we have our table tag, we have our row tag, and then our column span and row spans always go in these cells. They go in the TD. Now notice, like the one that has an error, where I had 2 TD tags in this row, but only 1 TD tag in this row. This one's not an error, even though I only have 1 TD tag in this row and 2 TD tags in this row, because I'm using column span. Yeah, I have said col span equals 2. Remember, you always put the quotation marks around property values. That is very important. Do not forget the quotation marks. They might not cause you problems yet, but they will in the future if you do not build the habit of putting quotation marks around property values. So we got TD, col span equals 2. And what that's saying is this particular cell takes up 2 columns. And so if we look at our HTML, sure enough, here's one column, here's a second column, and this top cell here takes up 2 columns, which is the correct way of doing this versus this right here. Now, what's going on with this TR align equals? Again, as you can tell by the bright red text, this is the old-fashioned way of doing things. I am saying that any and all text inside of this row needs to be center aligned. Which, as you can see, it clearly is. In addition to column span, we can have a row span. So taking a look at the next one down, this one right here, we can see that cell 1A has a row span of 2, so it is taking up 2 rows. Notice that there's no align on this one, and yet it is center aligned. By default, tables will always center align, or vertically align, I should say. It will always vertically align text to the center. So regardless of how tall a cell is, its contents will be centered vertically inside of the cell. If you wanted to align horizontally, then you do have to do alignment formatting, but vertically, it's always centered by default. So that one is a row span. And even with these two simple examples here, you can begin to see the kinds of flexibility that you could get with table formatting, especially once you take away the borders and you can't tell that the table is being used. By mixing and matching different row spans and call spans, you would be able to get some very creative layouts for your information. One final thing to keep in mind on tables is that you can nest tables within tables, like I mentioned at the start of this. So here, I've got a copy of this table here, but instead of having cell 2B as the data inside this cell, I have another table, this time with a 5-pixel border. And you can see, yep, sure enough, here's cell 1A, here's cell 2A, and this cell has another table inside of it. And I could put another table inside of here, and I could put another table inside of that, so on, so forth, ad nauseum. I forgot to turn Steam off again. One moment. That's better. But yeah, you can nest tables as far as you want. Now, there does get to be a certain point where nesting your tables is going to be slightly silly. So don't get too carried away with that idea. Again, nesting tables in the modern era of HTML design is probably something that you shouldn't do. There are potentially some specific use cases in which nesting tables within tables would still be a thing that you want to do. But more generally speaking, you are going to want to use divs and format your content that way rather than going through the insanity of trying to figure out nested tables. But it is still perfectly viable and can create some interesting results. Okay, what is this week's assignment besides reading up on tables? Create your schedule. A class schedule is a good example of something that might be displayed in a table format. So the idea behind this assignment is you are going to create a table that shows your current class schedule. Now, if you are taking less than 3 classes, choose some additional classes so that way your table has at least 3 classes in it. The table should have a 2-pixel border using the border property. Again, don't use styles for this. I want you to use the border property on your table using the old style like this. So it should say border equals 2px. The first row should have one cell that says My Schedule in bold text, centered. Again, you can use the legacy align equals center in TR or TD. It works in both tags. So the first row should have one cell that says My Schedule in bold text, centered. The second row should have 2 cells saying course ID and title, both in bold and centered. And then the remaining rows should be default text and contain the appropriate course ID and title information. The web page itself should have a title of My Schedule. And you need to make sure that it is a properly formatted HTML document. In other words, it's got the doc type, the HTML tag, head tag, obviously title, so on and so forth. It's got all the appropriate tags to be considered a properly formatted document. There will also be a screenshot on Blackboard, but also here is a completely fictional schedule. but this shows what it should look like. So we got the My Schedule, just taking up the entire first row there, course ID, title, and then the actual course IDs and titles of the courses. Remember, when you are done, to use GitHub to push your index.html page back up to the repository, and to post on Blackboard to let me know when this is done so I know to go take a look at it. And with that, that's all I got. Good luck with the assignment, and I'll catch you on the next video.